I think I'd like to call on our first speaker, Dr. Kim Byran, who's a Merseysider. I'm told that Kim's passion for social justice began at the age of 8, when her family became involved in a rent strike. The author of Thousands Say We Won't Pay, a history of housing struggles from 1968 to 73. Kim is the General Secretary of the Socialist Labour Party and will address us on the issue of the European Union and NATO. Kim, over to yourself.
Can everybody hear me? Is that okay? Yeah? Okay. Comrades, among the native populations of the United States and Canada, rates of suicide are so high, especially among the young, the community is experiencing what Ron Hutchcraft called serial grieving. In Australia, 95% of Aboriginals are directly affected by suicide. A people among whom suicide was at one time so rare there is no word for it in their language, are now 6 times more likely than white Australians to commit suicide. 80% of youth suicides in that country are among the Aborigine population. According to Jack Hicks, this suicide transition mirrors, roughly 1 generation later, the processes of active colonialism at the community level. Alaska in the 60s, Greenland in the 70s, Canada in the 80s. Like the mining and steel communities here, the traditional fishing-based industries on which their economy was built has been wiped out. Native peoples whose cultures developed over centuries have become strangers in their own land, not accounted for in any way by their fellow citizens as part of any collective space. What has been taken from them is the core component of human relations, home and a sense of belonging. Now, the Inuit are not the victims of environmental changes, acts of nature, or people moving. We've always had those things. They're the victims of an ideology that's grown from the tree of industrial capitalism, exceptionalism. Assuming a responsibility to expand and to intervene in the lives of the unexceptional, exceptionalism is the everyday thinking framework of the elites of European society. Subverting the principle of peaceful coexistence, this ideology is the single greatest obstacle in the world today to justice in the distribution of resources and life chances. The reality for those whose self-determination is subverted in this way, who lose influence over the terms on which they live their lives, has been idealized historically here as internationalism, a necessary progression for humanity, bringing technology, Christianity, Western values, freedoms, democracy to people whose existence and culture is, in the very terminology of the term nation building, being denied. So today, it's been dressed to suit our modern sensibilities. What Ramsay MacDonald called this worthy ambition is portrayed as openness, an interest in the lives of others, the ideal, the gift to humanity of a diverse and tolerant society. In this brave new world, it doesn't matter what you are, it matters only what you want to be. The modern world is moulded for elite people to live their dreams. Now, it was never intended that the fine ideals of the UN Charter would be applied to their creators. The goals of Western elitism have been realised today slightly differently. The unipolar order is now guaranteed not by the UN, but by the military power of NATO. The Warsaw Pact was formed in May 1955 after NATO, signalling its true objectives, admitted into membership not the USSR, but instead West Germany. Given this directive, the end of the Warsaw Pact in 1991 has made no difference to NATO's thinking or policy. The maintaining peace in Europe role with which NATO announced its creation in 1949 was repeated almost verbatim 2 years later in the Treaty of Paris, which became the European Union. Since 1991, with no USSR, NATO has intensified its nation building. Bosnia, Kosovo, it funded armed insurrections, breaking up Yugoslavia, the only genuinely non-aligned sovereign state in Europe. Iraq, a nation bombed, disarmed, starved and vilified for a decade, was finished off by a full-scale invasion and occupation. The invasion of Afghanistan, followed by the destabilization of Libya and Syria, the familiar combination of mass bombing and the funding and arming of insurgencies. The Ukraine, a democratically elected leader overthrown in a Western orchestrated coup, sparking a civil war in the east of the country. Currently, NATO powers are waging proxy wars in Yemen and the Sudan, and through political, economic, military pressure, they're laying the groundwork for the subjugation of Cuba, North Korea, Venezuela, and Iran. The victims are alike in one respect only. Through maintaining some level of national control of their economies, they are acting outside the parameters of this post-war world order. In its objective to create a single market for goods, services and labour, a customs union and common policies on agriculture, transport and social welfare, the Treaty of Rome mirrors economically the military goals of NATO. Described in its constitution as an essential partner sharing common values, 22 nations combine their membership of the EU with membership of NATO. The 6 non-NATO members are included in all NATO-EU consultations and understandings, including the 2002 agreement, which gives EU nations assured access to NATO for military operations. On the 8th of July 2016, NATO and the EU agreed operational cooperation on all the core elements of foreign policy: migration, cybersecurity, defence. The independence of Europe, comrades, is as fake as the independence of the UK's nuclear deterrent. Inseparable as twin pillars of this world order, neither NATO nor the EU can be redirected. As envisaged in the Maastricht Treaty, the NATO powers of Western Europe are the defence component of the European Union. In 2018, this year, 95% of deaths in wars across the world, more than 100,000, have occurred in just 4 conflict zones: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, NATO's priority theatres. The leader of the Western Alliance, the US, occupies just under 800 military bases in more than 70 countries across the world, used entirely for carrying out attacks on the territory of other sovereign states. In comparison, the UK, France, and Russia boast a total of 30 bases combined. No nation or empire in history, regardless of its ideology, has ever exhibited a fraction of this level of ambition or inflicted upon weaker nations a comparable brand of global destruction. Certainly not China or Russia. Far from it, both are becoming encircled by the US military. Brexit, wrote William Keegan in last week's Observer, is like being in the Premier League and wanting to be relegated. For elite people, open borders is not about fellowship, but status, the right of leadership in international affairs. The illusion that European institutions, immersed in this poisonous idea of entitlement, can be a force for good is destroying the ability of left-leaning people to reach beyond this monolithic system and to find a different dream. When the principle governing our lives is the service of the market, all ideas are overwhelmed by the financial interest that market creates. Economic and military policy is fused in the service of those interests, with no capacity to serve the needs of the people. Limited as we are in what we as socialists can achieve here, rarely do opportunities arise for the power of that market to be disrupted. Comrades, the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European Union is such an opportunity. Thank you.